Okay. Good morning. I am Eduardo Mendieta. I'm a professor of philosophy at Penn State University. I would like to welcome you to this author meets critics session on Professor Brandom's A Spirit of Trust, a reading of Hegel's Phenomenology. I'm particularly delighted to be hosting, chairing this session, because originally we had a very distinguished, and we still have a distinguished set of speakers, but due to the shift in format, we lost one of our speakers, and we're still waiting to have our other speakers join us. This is Permin Stekeler-Weinhofer, a professor from Germany. Let me just explain the mechanics, how we're going to proceed. Professor Robert Brandom will begin with a précis of the book. So he is going to give us a sense of what was motivating him and the structure of the book and the main arguments. Then we're going to proceed to Professor Mark Okrent, who will give us an overview and some comments. Hopefully, Professor Permin Stekeler-Weinhofer will join us. And then if he is able to join us, he'll give us his presentation. Here's someone, okay, I've met. And then we'll have a Q&A. Let me just say a couple of things about Professor Brandom, who is unquestionably one of the most important American philosophers of the last half of century. He's the author of many books, several of which are some of my favorite books. Tales of the Mighty Dead, a favorite book on which I organized a seminar several years ago. Perspectives of Pragmatism, which is an incredible look at American pragmatism, and Making Explicit, a book that I think is already a classic of American philosophy. And now we have another major work that puts contemporary American analytic philosophy with contemporary European philosophy. So I'm delighted to have Professor Brandom and to have organized this session on his incredible work. I'm also delighted to have Professor Okrent join us, who has written on pragmatism and pragmatism's relationship to European philosophy, in particular Heidegger, and Professor Permin Stekeler-Weinhofer, who is a major German scholar on Hegel. He has written a 2-volume commentary on the Phenomenology, which is really an incredible work to look at. And he has edited a volume on Professor Brandom's Making It Explicit. So with that, Professor Brandom, welcome, and you might take it away.
Well, thank you. So it's standard on these occasions to give a précis of the book that we're going to talk about. This is no small task for a book of this size, but it's near and dear to my heart. Let me try. A Spirit of Trust translates and deciphers the philosophical metavocabulary that Hegel develops in the Phenomenology, the language he deploys to enable us to talk and think about discursive practice. Sprache, he tells us, is the Dasein of Geist. Language is the concrete existence of Geist, of what his book is a phenomenology of. All of our normative doings and institutions and everything they make possible. I read Hegel as offering a broadly pragmatist theory of meaning in terms of use. And I understand Hegel's pragmatics of discursiveness as structured by dual social and historical axes. He understands the normativity of discursive practice as instituted socially by practical attitudes of reciprocal recognition between selves who only become self-conscious by recognizing one another as normative subjects, able to take responsibility and exercise authority. He understands the determinate contentfulness of concepts, their semantics, in terms of the pragmatic activity of retrospectively, recollectively, rationally reconstructing their actual applications so as to give such contingent sequences of doings the shape of expressively progressive traditions, turning a past into a history. That's revealing them as the gradual emergence into explicitness of norms that show up as having all along implicitly governed the process of applying concepts. At the beginning of that journey, of the journey to that finale, on the ground floor of Hegel's intellectual edifice, is a non-psychological conception of the conceptual. This is the idea that to be conceptually contentful is to stand in relations of material incompatibility and consequence to other such conceptually contentful items. This is his first and most basic semantic idea, an understanding of conceptual content in terms of modally robust relations of exclusion and inclusion. This understanding of the conceptual is hylomorphic. Conceptual contents, understood as roles with respect to relations of material incompatibility and consequence, are amphibious. They show up in two different forms. They have a subjective form and an objective form. The subjective form articulates what things are or can be for consciousness. And the objective form articulates what things are or can be in themselves. The second is the form of empirical reality. The first is the form in which that empirical reality appears to knowing subjects. On the side of thought, these are deontic normative constraints. One subject ought not to have incompatible empirical and practical commitments and ought to acknowledge the consequences of those she does acknowledge. On the side of being, these are alethic modal constraints. One object cannot have incompatible properties and necessarily has the properties that follow from its other properties. Those are related as the two poles of the intentional nexus, what can be known and the attempted knowing of it, noumena and phenomena. Subjectivity and objectivity are both conceptually articulated, and the very same conceptual content can show up for both, in the subjective normative form of thoughts and in the objective modal form of states of affairs. Genuine knowledge occurs when one and the same content shows up in both different forms, the subjective form of thought and the objective form of fact. I call this view bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism. Hegel's second semantic idea is this consequence of the hylomorphic development of the first. Conceptual contents of the two forms stand in broadly representational relations to one another, as subjective representings of reality and as the objective realities represented. These two dimensions of semantic contentfulness, the conceptual and the representational, can be thought of as Hegelian versions of the Fregean metaconcepts of sense and reference, Sinn und Bedeutung. Thoughts and what thoughts are about, what can be expressed and what can be represented. Hegel's semantic explanatory strategy is to explain the second representational dimension of conceptual contentfulness in terms of the first expressive dimension. What it is to represent something is to be understood in terms of relations among conceptual contents. The idea of noumenal reality is to be explained in terms of how phenomenal appearances point beyond themselves in virtue of their relations to one another. This is one central sense in which his book counts as a phenomenology. The semantic relations between these two forms of conceptual content are understood in the pragmatic context of processes and practices of intentional action. Reason is purposive agency, Hegel says more than once in the Phenomenology. Regarded prospectively, practical agency is the experience of coping with cognitive error and practical failure. But regarded retrospectively, it's reconstructed by the exercise of recollective rationality as the actualization and determination of a normatively governing intention, which both provides standards for assessments of correctness or success on the deontic normative side of the knowing subject, and to which the process is subjunctively sensitive, tracking on the alethic modal side of the known object. Hegel explains the representational semantic dimension of conceptual content, relations between thoughts and things, phenomena and noumena, appearances and reality, in terms of this essentially temporally biperspectival pragmatics of rational agency. The historical process by which conceptual contents are determined, prospectively made and retrospectively found, exhibits the social structure of coordinate reciprocal authority and responsibility that's characteristic of the institution of normative statuses by mutual recognitive attitudes. It is a social recognitive process. The normative pragmatics accordingly explains and articulates the interrelations of the inferential, the social, and historical holisms that are characteristic of Hegel's semantics. Reasons, in the form of objective conceptual norms, show up retrospectively as acknowledged in the attitudes of practitioners, hence as setting normative standards, articulating the contents of the commitments they undertake and the authority they claim, within each generous, forgiving recollection, exhibiting a progressive tradition of imperfect but cumulative, ever more explicit, and ultimately successful expressions of those concepts. On the other side, particularity, contingency, and immediacy enter during the prospective phase of experience, making themselves felt as practitioners find themselves falling into error and failure by applying their current conceptions, as they find themselves with theoretical and practical commitments that are incompatible by their own lights, and so which normatively call for the alteration of those conceptions and a reconstrual of that tradition. What is, when it appears, still irrational, Hegel's moment of difference, the immediate eruption of causes into the mediating realm of concepts, the exercise by particulars of authority over universals, shows up in the breaks, the ruptures, the caesuras between the Whiggish Erinnerungen. The first is the construction of concepts. The second is the incorporation into them of initially non-conceptual immediacy and contingency, in virtue of which those concepts are determinately contentful. The recognitive cycle of confession, trust, and recollective forgiveness, followed by confession of the inadequacy of that forgiveness, and trust in subsequent forgiveness of that failure, is what ties these phases together, articulating the internal fine structure of the relations between the moment of rational unity and the moment of determinate disparity. Under the heading of Vernunft, Hegel is putting forward a new metaphysics of meaning and intentionality, a highly structured story about the pragmatics of semantics, about the sorts of doings that are the necessary background for saying or intending or thinking anything determinately contentful, and about the sense in which concepts can be thought of as having determinate contents. Hegel's story about how determinate conceptual contents arise out of normative force, what it is by recollecting to take objective conceptual norms to be acknowledged as binding in the attitudes of discursive practitioners, and thereby to make those attitudes properly intelligible as the adoption of normative statuses, the undertaking of commitments and responsibilities that outrun the conceptions of those whose statuses they are, is accordingly supposed to be at once a theory and a fighting faith for the first generation of moderns for whom intellectual history came to seem a central and essential undertaking, Hegel's contemporaries. What he offers is, remarkably, a semantics that's morally edifying. For properly understanding the conditions of having determinate thoughts and intentions, of binding ourselves by determinately contentful conceptual norms in judgment and action, turns out, on Hegel's view, to commit us to adopting to one another practical recognitive attitudes of a particular kind: forgiveness, confession, and trust. The sort of Hegelian semantic self-consciousness that consists in understanding our discursive activity according to the categories of Vernunft accordingly obliges us to be certain kinds of selves and to institute certain kinds of communities. In particular, the sort of theoretical understanding he teaches, the explicit acknowledgement of what he shows to be implicit in our discursive practice, obliges us to in practice to forgive and to trust one another, to be that kind of self, and to institute that kind of community. Practicing the recollective recognitive hermeneutics of magnanimity is not just one option among others. A proper understanding of ourselves as discursive creatures obliges us to institute a community in which reciprocal recognition takes the form of forgiving recollection, a community bound by and built on trust. Recollective rationality is also the key, both to understanding the history of Geist, all of our norm-governed practices and performances, and the statuses, selves, and institutions they produce and are produced by, and to envisaging its next development. For Hegel, the turning point of history so far, simply the most important thing that ever happened to us, has been the gradual, still incomplete transition from traditional to modern forms of life. This was a shift from a metaphysics of normativity structured by the status dependence of normative attitudes to one structured by the attitude dependence of normative statuses. The mistake characteristic of traditional life is fetishism. Mistaking the norms that are in fact the products of our activities for objective features of the world. Modernity is the advent of a distinctive kind of normative self-consciousness of our own role in instituting those norms. The pathology characteristic of modernity is alienation from the norms that make us what we are, failure to understand them practically as rationally constraining. The alienation that's the worm in the shining apple of modernity is the practical incapacity to see how those normative statuses can both be instituted by our normative attitudes and transcend those attitudes so as genuinely to constrain them. His conception of Vernunft and how it overcomes the commitment to mastery as pure independence that's manifested in Verstand is Hegel's response to this challenge. It's what animates the postmodern shape of self-conscious practical agency that he points towards. At the heart of Vernunft is the conception of a new kind of rationality and a new kind of understanding, recollective rationality. It emerges through a distinctive kind of retrospective rational reconstruction of the course of development of one's commitments. The conception of Vernunft, whose heart is recollection, is what explains the reciprocity of the normative statuses of authority and responsibility. Hegel's independence and dependence. It explains the sense in which these are always two sides of one coin. And it explains the reciprocity of normative recognitive attitudes of acknowledging and attributing authority and responsibility, and the relations between them. And in doing so, it reconciles the distinctively modern insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses, the sense in which statuses of authority and responsibility are instituted by our reciprocal recognitive attitudes, with the traditional appreciation of the status dependence of normative attitudes. This is the dimension along which attributions and acknowledgements of commitments, responsibilities undertaken by exercising one's authority to do so, answer for their correctness to what agents are really committed to. The key to understanding the way Hegel moves beyond the basic Hegelian normative statuses, jointly socially instituted by synchronic reciprocal social relations of recognitive attitudes, consists in appreciating the orthogonal, diachronic, historical dimension of recognitive processes. When recognition takes the form of confession and forgiving by retrospective, rational, reconstructive recollection, the insights of traditional practical and modern theoretical normative self-consciousness will be reconciled and their failures overcome. We'll then move decisively beyond the normative structure of subordination and obedience to genuine self-conscious freedom, to Geist with the structure of trust. That's the story.
Thank you so much, Professor Brandom. I've been in email contact with Perman, and I'm not sure why he's not able to get online, but hopefully he will be able to get online. Professor Okrent, you are now ready to take it away? Okay, you can also share your screen.
I will. Thank you. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to start by thanking Bob for this book. It's a really marvelous achievement, well worth spending a lifetime on, both as a reader and as an author. It's an extraordinary book. What I'm going to do today is not do what Bob just did amazingly well, which is try to outline the argument of the book. I tried and failed. It's the argument is many faceted, has many strands, all of which are intimately connected. And the whole edifice is intricately articulated in a way that makes it very difficult to outline what's going on there. What I would do is recommend that you all read the book. If you haven't bought it yet, you should run right over to Amazon and buy it. And if it's sitting on your desk because it's a daunting task to put in the time and effort to work through it, you should do so anyway. It's well worth the activity. Having said that, I'm going to construct a minor criticism of one of the aspects of Bob's work. I don't see it really as a criticism. I see it as a friendly suggestion. Professor Brandom may see it differently. What I'm going to do is basically accept the very many premises that go into Bob's argument, and then suggest that what he has to say about truth really doesn't follow from the considerations he advances regarding that concept. Before I start, I should say something about my terminology. When talking about the book, I refer to Brandom rather than Hegel or Brandom's Hegel. It's a difficulty, in fact, deciding, who one should talk about when discussing the book. My decision to talk about Brandom has to do with Bob's own hermeneutics. He has a really lovely small section that he affixes oddly to the end of chapter 9 about the methodology he's following, in which he suggests that there are a variety of ways to interpret philosophical documents. One of them involves adding to the premises that are present in the text or present in other places in the author's corpus, premises that we hold to be true, that we derive from the history since then. So the interpretation that Brandom is offering of the phenomenology is one that includes an acceptance of theses that he derives from a whole variety of sources in the history prior to us, but after Hegel. Frege figures prominently. Wittgenstein, the late Wittgenstein, figures prominently. Hilary Putnam, I think, figures prominently at a certain point. David Lewis is referred to. And needless to say, I think Bob takes over premises he thinks are true from himself. So the interpretation of the phenomenology is really doing two jobs, I think. One is offering a really interesting, novel, informative interpretation of the phenomenology itself. The other is providing a capstone to Professor Brandom's attempt over the last half century to construct his own philosophical system. And the two are related to one another in such a way that it's very difficult to extricate one part of the achievement from the other. And I think they're both remarkable achievements. So that's my explanation for why it is that I refer to Brandom rather than Hegel or Hegel's Brandom. I do so because I'm really interested in a systematic aspect of a spirit of trust, having to do with the relationship between two of the theses that Bob attributes to Hegel by way of interpreting his idealism. So if you look at the handout, the first quote there is one of the ways that Bob lays out the three aspects of Hegel's idealism as he sees it. The first commitment is to what I have called conceptual realism. The second commitment is to what I call objective idealism. The third is to what I call conceptual idealism. I offer these claims as a tripartite analysis of Hegel's idealism, claiming that this view is what you get when you endorse all of them. I take it that they form a hierarchy with each commitment presupposing those that came before it. I'm interested in the relation between conceptual realism and conceptual idealism, as Bob lays it out. Conceptual realism is one on the handout, the doctrine that the way the world is in itself is conceptually articulated. That's a remarkable claim. I think it's a true claim. I think it's true to Hegel as well. The claim that the world in itself is conceptually articulated raises all sorts of questions. Most primary, or in my mind, is what's meant by conceptual. The argument Bob gives in the book for conceptual realism is neat, it's elegant, and it's very easily understood. he infers conceptual realism from the acknowledgement of the laws of nature and a certain definition of conceptual, that is standing in relations of material consequence and exclusion. I probably got the quote wrong there, but basically that's what it amounts to. And the idea here is that the laws of nature fix modal relations of consequence and exclusion among the facts that comprise the world, the states of affairs that comprise the world. So, for example, if it is a fact that this wire is copper, I played with the idea of going to a hardware store and getting a copper wire, but given the plague, I decided not to do it. But this wire is copper, then that guarantees that there's another fact. If it were heated to 1085 Celsius, it would melt, right? So that's a material relation of consequence. Similarly, the fact that the cover of my copy of A Spirit of Trust is black excludes the possibility of another fact, that is that the cover is yellow. The facts themselves stand in relations of consequence and exclusion. So given that definition and the laws of nature, I might add that also involved here is a certain Aristotelianism in regard to properties and relations that Bob skipped over in his précis, but is very well articulated in the book. Given those, it follows, conceptual realism follows. That is, that the world is in itself is conceptually articulated. Certain things follow from that. The first is the reference independence of the world from any thought about it. The second quote here expresses that. If Newton's laws are true, then they held before there were thinkers and would held even if there never were thinkers. The facts governed by those Newton's laws, for instance, early collisions of particles, stood in lawful relations of relative impossibility and necessity to other possible facts, and hence on this conception to the conceptual had conceptual content, quite independently of whether any subjective processes of thinking had gone on, were going on, or ever would go on in this or any other possible world. I really love the parenthesis there. I wouldn't have thought to put it in, but I'm glad Bob did. The facts of the world stand in relations of exclusion, modal relations of exclusion and consequence. And from that, it follows that the world as it is in itself, conceptually articulated as it is independent of any thought that actually or possibly may be the case about it. Second thing that follows is the bimodal hylomorphism that Bob was talking about earlier. Since Bob's inferentialism also involves conceptual articulation as he's just defined it, there are two forms of conceptual articulation, one involving alethic modal relations of necessity and exclusion, the other deontic modal relations of acceptance of consequence and exclusion. This raises an interesting question. There are these two holistic structures of modal relations of consequence and exclusion. One of them involving alethic relations, which are independent of any thought about them. The other deontic relations, such that if one acknowledges or commits oneself to some thought, you ought to exclude others and you ought to infer others. So the question arises in regard to what the character of that ought is. Now, approximately, the ought arises on Brandom's reading from the recognitive relations among normative attitudes. It's a normative status, and in a recognitive community, analyzed as Bob does Hegel's concept of recognition, if suitably related to one another, the normative attitudes ground an ought. So if I were to claim or acknowledge that this wire is copper, and it doesn't melt when it's heated to 1085, then I've made an error. The error could be of the form that the wire is iron. That is, that I've made an error regarding the norm that specifies how the concept copper ought to be applied. As that norm is instituted in my recognitive community, I've forgotten all my college chemistry, and I've just made an error of application of the concept. As Bob says over and over in the book, and it's worth saying over and over, what I believe, that I believe P is up to me. What I believe when I believe P is not up to me. The reason it's not up to me is a Wittgensteinian reason. If it were up to me, then P could have no determinate content whatsoever. It's only if there's someone to whom I attribute the authority to hold me responsible for what I'm believing or saying, that it's possible for what I think or say to have any content whatsoever. So approximately, what I'm committed to when I say this wire is copper, not being up to me, is up to the recognitive community in which I'm embedded. On the other hand, recognitive communities can be an error. That is, the senses, the inferential roles that are assigned to thoughts within that community can and do fall into error. If you look at number 3 on the handout, this is a quote from later in the book. Bob says the following: error and failure are the results of mistaken senses, endorsement of conceptual contents that implicitly involve mistakes concerning what follow from and what is incompatible with what. And those senses, we know from history, can go wrong because of errors in the community. Circa 1750, the best chemists in Europe authorized an inference from S's burning to S's giving off phlogiston. It's a mistaken inference. And that involves a mistake regarding what it is to be burning. It's a mistake in the sense of that thought that S is burning. We discover such errors often through perception. Sometimes we discover them by discovering contradictions in our belief set, but often it's through perception. The occasioning being perceptual beliefs. There's a whole story that Bob doesn't go into at all in this book on the status of perceptual belief. And there's a lot of things that could be said about that, but I'm going to skip it. Rather, I'm going to refer you to quote 5 on the handout, where he talks about perceptual beliefs. The intrusions of commitments arrived at non-inferentially in perception give rise to anomalies through engendering incompatibilities. Giving these eruptions the form of necessity is incorporating them into an expressively progressive recollective narrative that exhibits them as the agents whereby the true contents of concepts are gradually revealed and become more explicit. So here's the story. We have a perceptual belief. We observe a stick. This is a traditional example that Bob uses early in the book. We perceive a stick partially submerged in water. The stick appears to us to be bent. We pull it out. We get the perceptual belief that it's straight. We believe throughout that it is rigid. This is an incompatibility in our beliefs. We acknowledge that incompatibility by doing something, that is revising, rectifying the beliefs so that the incompatibility disappears. There's a couple of things to notice about that description. First, it's a description of us having experience, learning something from our engagement with the world. Second, the it that's referred to as being bent and being straight, the stick, is the same stick in the judgment that it is bent and it is straight. That we treat it as the same stick is indicated by acknowledging a responsibility to revise our beliefs. Because of course, if it were two different sticks, there would be no such responsibility. So reference emerges in the process of acknowledging error and rectifying it. Further, what we do when we do this is revise our concept of the stick. We revise what can be properly inferred from the stick, this being this stick. Certain things about what would appear are now under different circumstances are now revised. These are the first two stages in the process of experience: acknowledgement of error, rectification of the error. The third element is recollection. In recollection, we recollect the process by which our concepts progressively get altered so as to remove error. The third element in the tripartite analysis of Hegel's idealism, conceptual idealism, has to do with this third element, recollection, third element of experience, recollection. The process of experience is a process that involves not merely rectifying errors, but recollecting, rationally reconstructing after the fact, the process through which we come to have our current conceptions of error. This process shows us the errors in our past senses of our thoughts. It also, according to Brandom, if you look at the very end, you get of my handout, you'll get a specification of what conceptual idealism amount to, and I should stop and read those. According to the claim I've been calling conceptual idealism, the second order relations between what things objectively are in themselves and the experiential processes in which they show up as something for consciousness are to be understood in the first instance in terms of those subject constitutive empirical practical processes Erfahrung, now understood as the cycle of action and cognition, culminating in the recollective rational reconstruction of the experience. Second quote, several pages on. And this one's important. What establishes the relation between sense and referent is treating one's current commitments as setting a normative standard that now governs and implicitly already all along did govern one's previous commitments. What one must do in order thereby to be taking it in practice, that one is talking or thinking about some way things are in themselves, is to perform a recollection of the experiential processes that yielded that result. So to take one of Bob's examples, we take it that when Aristotle in his biological writings was talking about hands, he was talking about the same things, referring to the same things as we do when we talk about hands. But of course, the senses he was using, the descriptions he was using of hand are quite different from ours. He didn't know anatomy in the same way we do. He certainly didn't have a knowledge of the evolutionary history of hands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Nevertheless, we can say that he was referring to the same things we do now because we can recollect the history of the rectifications of the errors that Aristotle was making that led to our current conception of hands. And in doing that, it fixes the reference of all these senses to the same thing that we're referring to now. And we can use that, that sense that we currently have as a norm to judge the previous ones. Aristotle was making mistakes about hands. He wasn't talking about some weird Aristotle hands and saying true stuff about them. Okay, so that's the picture that Bob is laying out. Because of that picture, going back up to earlier in the handout, if error is a mistake in senses, that is endorsement of conceptual contents that implicitly involve mistakes concerning what follow from and is incompatible with what, this also tells us something about truth. And Bob draws the inference straightforwardly in the next paragraph, I think, in A Spirit of Trust. He says of Hegel that the role played by concern for truth is played by concern for correct inferences, for what a sense or content really follows from and is really incompatible with what. So truth, then, is correct inference. Entirely correct inference and enduring correct inference. We have our senses right if they lead to only correct inferences. That's what truth is. Now, of course, that they can only lead to correct inferences, and that's an enduring fact about our belief set, indicates that there's a total isomorphism between the inferences that we accept, given our recognitive community, as inferences we ought to make, the deontic relations within our belief set, with the alethic relations among the facts of the world. So an alternative way of understanding truth on this view is as complete isomorphism between the conceptual articulation of thought and the conceptual articulation of the facts of the world. So we have two ways of conceptualizing truth: as enduring, complete, correct inference, and as a total isomorphism between the deontic modal relations of our thoughts and the alethic modal relations among the facts that constitute the world. That's what truth is on this account, I think, given what Bob has said to this point. Now, Bob doesn't say it that way. Rather, in the conclusion of the book, he says the following: understanding the experiential process, which comprises both what shows up when that process is viewed retrospectively and what shows up when it is viewed prospectively, so as to see truth and error as equally essential, complementary aspects of it, requires reconceptualizing both truth and determinateness. The key in each case is to understand them not as properties, states, or relations that can be instantiated at a single time, but as structural features of enduring experiential processes. I don't think Bob ever actually lays out the argument for this claim in the book. He does it for the determinateness of concepts. He takes it implicitly, I think, that the same argument regarding truth applies. He does have an argument for the determinateness of concepts being a enduring structural feature of experiential processes. The argument goes something like this. The traditional concept of truth, of determinateness of concepts, traditional notion of concepts implies that they're determinate in such a way that they say for any particular whether a concept applies to it or doesn't apply to it, independently of the development of the concept itself. But on Bob's reading, whatever determinateness concepts have, they have through the double structure of contemporary recognition in a community and the diachronic structure of the history of the concepts of the lineage in those communities. So there is no determinateness to concepts independently of the fixing of the boundary of concepts. Now, that by itself doesn't imply that after the most recent glorious revolution, we don't have completely correct concepts, that is, completely correct inferential patterns. It only implies that those patterns have to be understood as developing historically. In order to get to the conclusion that there never can be determinateness of content, of concepts, in the first sense, you need another premise. And I take what that premise is Putnam's meta-induction to it being the case that 50 years from now, we will see that much of what we currently believe in regard to the laws of nature will have been shown to be false. Given that, there's never concepts Verstand, which fix once and for all which individuals fit under which concepts. But the same argument doesn't work, I think, for truth. The reason it doesn't work is that what we're talking about when we talk about truth is, as I said before, enduring correctness of inference, complete correctness of inference, and or complete isomorphism between the deontic modal structure of relations among our thoughts and the alethic modal structure of relations among facts. That's what we intend when we intend truth. What the argument shows, if it's applied to truth, is that we never achieve truth. Let's grant that. It may also show, together with everything else that Bob says, that I lost the train of my thought. Let me try to get it back. There is an argument that the reference of our thoughts is only fixed historically, and that may be right. But it doesn't follow from that consideration that what we intend when we intend something is true is merely something that emerges in the process of the development of experience. In fact, given the structure of experience and the Putnamian meta-induction, what we should infer is that the only element in enduring experiential processes in the area is what is intended as true or taken to be true. But it's built into Bob's own work that there's always a distinction in principle between what's intended as true and what is true. So in conclusion, I think Bob should revise that one sentence in 6 so as to leave out the comment about truth because I think it doesn't fit. Nevertheless, it's a wonderful book, and thank you, Bob.
So thank you, Professor Okrent. I'm still working in the background to get Perman Steckler-Weinhofer online, and I'll continue to do that. Professor Brandom, would you like to comment, respond immediately to Professor Okrent?
Sure. Marx offered a generous and sympathetic characterization of my project, but it leads him to diagnose a tension in it. A tension between the conceptual realism that is the first stage of my exposition of Hegel's absolute idealism, and the conceptual idealism that's the third and final stage of that exposition. Attention specifically focused on the notion of truth. He's doesn't think that this is that there's a corresponding problem for the notion of the determinateness of conceptual contents, if I understand him correctly. And he proposes to resolve it by appeal to the distinction between sense dependence and reference dependence that's the essence of the middle version, the middle stage in my account of Hegel's idealism, what I call objective idealism. And I think that's a very neat package. I admire that description. And I think the tension that he perceives is real, but I think it is resolved. So let me explicate that. So what I call conceptual realism, which explains the sense in which Hegel takes it we can genuinely know how things are, and more specifically, the bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism, understands truth as achieved when the alethic modal relations of material incompatibility and consequence, what's really impossible and necessary, the relations that articulate objective facts, how things are in themselves, in Hegel's term, when those relations are isomorphic with the deontic normative relations of material incompatibility and consequence among doxastic commitments, what we're forbidden or obliged to believe, that articulate our subjective conceptions, in Hegel's terms, how things are for us. This isomorphism is well expressed by the later Wittgenstein. He says, when we say and mean that such and such is the case, we in our meaning don't stop anywhere short of the fact, but we mean this is so. And his thought is, if things are in fact so, then that thought is true. But the final picture has it that this identity of fact and content of thought, though it is genuine, is a feature only of one perspective, only shows up from one perspective on the process that is at once empirical experience and the determination of the contents of our empirical concepts. It shows up in the retrospective, recollective, rational reconstruction of the course of our experience that exhibits it as expressively progressive, that is, as the gradual unfolding into explicitness of what was all along implicitly articulating the content of the concepts we were all along applying, even though we were often applying them incorrectly. And the trouble is that recollective, retrospective perspective is only half the story. When we look at things prospectively, we see that any such recollection is fragile in principle. It's not just that it might turn out to be inadequate to future experience. Hegel thinks he can show in principle it must be. Mark sensibly and constructively concludes the written version of his comments. This is quoting him. The problem here is that Brandom has not correctly identified the implications of the fact that reference is only fixed in the recollective phase of the experiential process. Since what it is for a commitment to be isomorphic with the conceptual articulation of what it's about presupposes the fixed reference of the belief, and such reference is only conceivable as the result of the experiential process, truth as complete isomorphism is only intelligible if the experiential process is intelligible. And this amounts to the sense dependence of the concept of truth on the concept of experience. But what it is the truth is, what we've come to see concerning truth through the experiential process, is the truth is that conceptual articulation of thought that, were it actualized, would lead to an unending correctness of all of our inferences, a correctness grounded in a perfect isomorphism between the conceptual articulation obligated by our own concepts and the conceptual articulation of the facts that comprise the world. And that state, though in fact unrealizable, is also no feature of the enduring process of experience. It is rather the goal of that process. That's the end of the quote from Mark's sort of more formal summary of his argument. So Mark takes it that on the final picture, conceptual realism is not really presenting how things are in themselves, but only how they are for us, a matter of our attitudes rather than the things themselves. And the friendly amendment that he proposes is to recharacterize truth and so genuine knowledge of how things really are in themselves as a sort of ideal, a goal of inquiry conception. It's not the Peircean conception. What separates it from the Peircean conception of truth as the ideal end of inquiry conception is the non-trivial qualification that it's acknowledged that this goal is in fact unreachable. Now, I accept the friendliness of the amendment, but not the amendment itself. And I don't, because the unreachability of the goal for Hegel is unreachability in an incredibly strong sense. For Hegel, it's impossible in principle that there should be any set of determinate empirical conceptual norms whose correct application according to those norms in judgment would not necessarily lead us eventually to what by those very norms count as incompatible commitments. So contrast this with the Kantian picture. For Kant, we have a set of determinate conceptual contents, and we may misapply them. I may pull off my shelf of available concepts, the concept dog, to synthesize the manifold in front of me. But as the manifold rolls on, that leads me to incompatible commitments, and I may need to put the dog concept back on the shelf and pull the fox concept out. And Kant thinks that we can't, and in this regard, Kant agrees with his empiricist predecessors and successors, that getting complete knowledge is an infinite task, that what we capture with these determinate concepts, though it can be that it's a fox, it's an infinite task for me to express every feature that's presented to me of the by the manifold of intuition. Hegel is claiming that the very idea of a set of determinate conceptual contents at the ground level that's adequate to sensuous immediacy, in the sense that by correctly applying them, we'll never, by our own lights, contradict ourselves, is due to a misunderstanding of the nature of determinate conceptual contents. It's unintelligible once we understand how conceptual contents work, that there should be an adequate set of concepts. Everyone is bound to end up self-contradictory. Well, he's worried, does that mean that he's buying into the skeptical conclusion that empirical knowledge is inevitably a path of despair? No, he thinks, that holds only if you have the Verstand picture of determinate conceptual contents as sharp boundaries that determine for any possible presentation whether the concept is properly applied to it or not. When we move to his dynamic, historical, recollective Vernunft conception, we'll see that itself is an unintelligible conception. I think Mark isn't fully appreciating just how radical the revision in ordinary philosophical ways of thinking that Hegel is proposing. In effect, Mark thinks that the second stage, objective idealist recognition of the reciprocal sense dependence of the semantic content of the concept fact and the pragmatic practices of making assertions, taking some claimables to be facts, is left undisturbed by the final conceptual idealist stage, and that to redeem the first stage of conceptual realism, it too must be, that is, the first stage too, must be left unchanged by the advance to the final conception of recollective rationality. But I understand the move to Vernunft, to conceptual idealism, to be transformative of both those earlier stages. Not that what they claim isn't so, but our understanding of what they're saying and what it takes for them to be so is transformed. The characterization of the situation that Mark is recommending, from my point of view, depends on construing both what the identity of content of thought and fact consists in on the cognitive side, and how goals or intentions relate to doings on the practical side, according to the categories of Verstand that Hegel's meta-concept of Vernunft is supposed to take us beyond. Because Hegel understands the content of the concept of objective reality and what things are in themselves in terms of what we must do in retrospectively, rationally reconstructing our experience by discerning expressively progressive trajectories within it, we're putting in place a new understanding of what objective reality is in itself. And on that conception, the necessary fragility and evanescence of our conceptions of objective reality that necessarily shows up from the prospective perspective on our practice is every bit as essential to what objective reality is in itself, and so to genuine truth and knowledge, as the tracking and isomorphism that necessarily shows up from the retrospective perspective on it. Both of those essentially complementary aspects are equally revelatory of truth and reality. Reconceptualizing the determinateness of concepts requires reconceptualizing the determinateness of facts. Reality is the sort of thing that can only be truly and adequately represented by applying constellations of unstable, essentially self-transcending concepts. When the distinction between sense and reference is understood according to the Hegelian, historically biperspectival vernunftlich conception, instead of the traditional Fregean and Kantian verständlich one, and when we move beyond Verstand's way of construing the relationship of goals to actions, we come to understand genuine truth and knowledge as what they are revealed to be not just by, but in the interplay of the retrospective and prospective perspectives, not as an unreachable goal. The difference is subtle, but I think it's essential to Hegel's radical philosophical vision. Yeah, Mark.
So is the alethic modal conceptual articulation of the world reference dependent from our thought about it, on your view?
No. I mean,
why?
Things would be as they are independently of our thought of it. That's a basic Hegelian commitment. He's not a subjective idealist or even a transcendental idealist on the conception of Kant that he was working with. But when we properly understand the relation between the objective facts and our subjective takings of them, we reconstrue what that objective world is. We now understand the only thing we can mean by that objective independent world is something that involves isomorphism that shows up only in the retrospective perspective on our experience. It's essentially one aspect of that isomorphism is essentially one aspect of the reality that shows up in experience. And it has a complementary aspect, which is the ungraspability in the Verstand sense of those facts, what shows up in the necessary instability of any particular grasp on them. I say, Hegel sees, I think, the tension that you're diagnosing and sees a threat that his view will look to be a skeptical view in making that claim. How can you claim that we have genuine knowledge if you also claim that any set of determinate conceptual ground level concepts, which are the only way we have to grasp it, must eventually show its inadequacy? And his answer is to, well, the best way I know to put it is to see that truth and genuine knowledge as consisting not in a state, but in a structural feature of this process. So I think that when you say, look, it's just what truth is, that the isomorphism between what we take to follow from what and be incompatible with what is permanently isomorphic with what really is, what really does follow from what and what really is incompatible with what. I think he wants to say, yeah, that's the common sense and traditional and Verstand picture of what truth is. But what I'm teaching you is, no, that's not the right way to think about it. That's not, in the end, not just unreachable in the way that Kant thought that sort of complete knowledge was unreachable. That's unintelligible even as an ideal, even as a goal. And yet, what we're doing in experience is genuinely knowing how things are. And that isomorphism picture of it is a correct picture of a necessary condition of it being genuine knowledge, but it's not the whole picture.
Professor Brandom, I just spent the last hour trying to get Perman online, and I think the problem is that he is in Germany, and when he tries to log on, it tries to get him on through Zoom Deutschland, and I'm still working on it. My suggestion is, I hope he'll be able to make it, is that you respond to Professor Perman, Steckler, Weishofer, and hopefully he'll be able to come online. So I think we can gather from your comments what his objections were. And then we should turn it over to our panelists, our audience.
Okay. Pierman and I are good friends for a long time, and it makes it almost overwhelmingly tempting for me to attribute some ridiculous straw man views to him having this opportunity, and then to refute them. But I won't indulge in that. So there's a couple of points that he makes that I can talk about in a way that maybe makes it is intelligible even without hearing him saying this. So Steckler emphasizes Hegel's focus on how much pragmatic stage setting there is, how many of our practices and abilities are presupposed by deploying semantic contents of various kinds. Now, this is a point on which he and I are agreeing, but semantic contents of supposedly immediate sensory experiences, the properties and related objects of common sense, and the theoretical entities postulated by natural science, paradigmatically Newtonian forces, which Hegel uses allegorically to stand in for all the posits of empirical science that are only cognitively accessible to us inferentially in terms of their observable effects. And Steckler approves of my reading. He also reads Hegel as criticizing a common tendency to treat all of those kinds of things, sensuously immediate, the empirically perceivable states of affairs, the frog being on the log, and even the theoretical entities of natural science as being cognitively given to us. He sees Hegel as criticizing views that are insufficiently sensitive to all the background abilities and social practices that are presupposed when we think of ourselves as being able to entertain semantic contents of those kinds. Hegel recommends instead that we think about what we have to do, the substantive abilities we have to exercise, the practices we have to engage in order to become capable of awareness of all those kinds of things and categories, and to deploy and apply empirical concepts with those features. We're talking about the consciousness chapters at the opening of the Phenomenology. And Stekeler and I agree, and I think in this regard, set ourselves apart from more traditional readings in understanding Hegel's distinctive sort of analysis of concepts and conceptual structures as consisting in articulating a pragmatic metavocabulary in which it's possible to say what subjects need to do in order to count as grasping, understanding, or applying various kinds of semantic contents. This is what I call Hegel's methodological pragmatism, the understanding of meaning in terms of use, of semantics in terms of pragmatics. Where I think Stekeler and I disagree in this common enterprise of reading Hegel as pursuing such a project is that I think one doesn't need to go beyond what Hegel says in the Phenomenology in order to have his full pragmatic metavocabulary on view. And for Stekeler, it's important that it's in the science of logic that that task is finally brought off. And so he wants to highlight places where the science of logic story, as he reads it, goes beyond where Hegel gets to in the Phenomenology. And I'm committed to that not being so, that is to being able to read the science of logic, at any rate, the conclusion of the science of logic, the picture he finally gets to, entirely in terms of the concepts that he puts in play in the Phenomenology. But that's a big commitment, that's a big aspiration. I don't do that. And Stekeler is interested in pressing on the places where he thinks Hegel introduced genuinely new and important ideas in the science of logic. And though I remain unconvinced, Stekeler's view has going for it that it was also Hegel's view explicitly. And that ought to count for something. I have to claim Hegel was mistaken about that too. So I'm just registering that there's a substantial disagreement there. In my original conception of this book, A Spirit of Trust, the final chapter was to be the argument that you didn't need to go beyond what I'd already found in play in the Phenomenology in order to understand the science of logic, and changing that plan, giving up the idea of writing that chapter, was a necessary condition of the book being writable and finishable. So Pierman may just have to do it. Okay, another issue where Pierman, well, generally applauding the account that I offer wants to qualify it and give a slightly different one, concerns the relation between the meta-conceptual categories of Verstand and Vernunft, what Hegel has made of these two Kantian notions, which we agree stand in for distinctive categorical structures, ways of thinking about how concepts work. The way I understand their relations, Kant's Kurz, not only Kant, but Frege is an avatar of Verstand. Concepts come with sharp boundaries that are fixed once and for all. We pull them off a shelf and apply them. But the first question Hegel asks Kant is, where do these sharply boundaried concepts with, as Wittgenstein said, there's sort of rails laid out to infinity. The boundaries mean that it's already settled for any possible candidate, whether they apply to them. Where do they come from? And what does our grasp of them consist in? We have to ask with Frege, what do we do to grasp senses in his sense so as to be able to apply them? And Vernunft is Hegel's term for a meta-conception of concepts that answers those questions, where both Kant and Frege sharply separated the process of instituting, establishing, or fixing conceptual norms from the process of applying them in judgment. I mean, Kant and Frege don't have satisfying stories about the first step, I think, but I think they're clearly committed to these being two different kinds of activities. Once we ask the pragmatic question about what you need to do to be deploying semantic contents like this. And Hegel objects to this division of labor, this separation of powers, for much the same reasons, I think, that Quine objected to a corresponding division of labor by Frege's student Carnap. I mean, Carnap had said, look, there's laying down your meanings, specifying the language, and then there's formulating a theory, deciding what beliefs to adopt, couched in the concepts expressed with the meanings that you've laid down in the first phase. And Quine, from, I think, a pragmatist concern with being able to say in a pragmatic metavocabulary what you have to do in order to be deploying these contents, says, look, there's only one thing that we do. We just talk, we make judgments and inferences, and that has to somehow count also as determining what we mean. In an artificial calculus, like Carnap was working with, you can say, well, we can separate the stipulation of the meanings in some semantically powerful meta language from the application of them. But in natural language, that distinction doesn't show up in what we actually do. And as I read him, Hegel is making a point like this, that we have to understand the determinateness of ground level determinate concepts, not the philosophical concepts, in terms of what we do in the process of determining their contents. And we have to see that as happening as an aspect of applying the concepts in committing ourselves cognitively as to how things are and practically as to how things shall be. And the process that determines those conceptual contents, the process of undertaking and defending and challenging those commitments, is what Hegel calls experience, Erfahrung, not the Erlebnisse. Regarded retrospectively, that process of determination is one of discovery. It's the gradual, progressive finding out of what the content has been all along, what the norm that implicitly governed and still governs applications of the concept of judgment. But regarded prospectively, that same process of determination is one of invention, of making rather than finding. It's the gradual, progressive fixing of the content, making what from a Verstand point of view looks like a partially indeterminate content ever more determinate in that Verstand sense by applying the concept in novel circumstances. But because he thinks of determinateness this way, determinateness is what's on the one hand unveiled and on the other hand produced in this process. Hegel rejects the possibility, this is just one of the consequences, but it's a methodologically important one, of conveying the content of a concept by defining it. As a matter of deep pragmatist semantic principle, for Hegel, the only way to understand the content of a determinate concept is by rationally reconstructing an expressively progressive history of the process of determining it by applying it. That's what he does in the Realphilosophie. That's what he does when he tells us about the concepts of art or of religion to convey these. The only way of conveying their determinate content is by constructing, recollecting an expressively progressive trajectory through the applications that makes the norm visible. Steckler offers an interestingly different, but I think consonant perspective on the Verstand-Vernunft distinction. Here I can give a little quote from him. He says, it's natural to think of using the concepts we find ourselves with as one activity and criticizing, reflecting on, and changing those concepts as another, an optional, late-coming activity. He says, Hegel sees that Verstand picture is wrong. On a proper Vernunftlich conception, we see applying concepts and reflectively criticizing and altering them as necessarily two sides of one coin. To use determinate empirical and practical concepts is to reveal their inadequacy and requires us to acknowledge and deal with it. So the way, that's the end of the quote, the way Steckler is thinking about it, it's what I've talked about as the institution of conceptual norms and the application of them being two sides of one coin. He sees what contrasts with the application in the Verstand case rather as critical reflection on them, as rationally challenging applications of them and defending them. As I say, I think this is a consonant picture, but it's not exactly the same one. And in articulating his different take, which usefully brings in the critical dimension of reason, he makes an illuminating and suggestive point that he sees as essential to Hegel's understanding of that reflection, that not only are doxastic commitments defeasible in that any particular belief we might have may turn out not to be rationally sustainable, but that the inferential relations of implication and incompatibility that articulate those conceptual contents are those relations, and so the conceptual contents themselves are defeasible. And he connects this to the non-monotonicity of inference in Hegel. Now, this is a fascinating idea, and I myself, in wearing a slightly different philosophical hat, have been much concerned with the non-monotonicity of inferential relations over the last decade or more. And I confess, it never occurred to me that among the things Hegel was struggling to craft philosophical language to say was that reason relations, implication relations are non-monotonic, that things we thought followed from a given claim may be defeated by collateral premises that we have. When we learn more about how the world is, we may find out that what followed in the old context does not follow in the new one, this non-monotonicity. And this is crucial to the way we understand the evolution of the whole constellation of doxastic and practical commitments, so beliefs and intentions on the one hand, and the broadly inferential commitments that articulate the contents of those, that whole vast constellation that in the science of logic he calls the concept. That's a holistic structure. Hegel was, maybe everybody agrees, the first philosopher who rigorously tried to think through this holism of concepts, had a tip of his hat to Spinoza, but as a recognizably semantic enterprise, it really was Hegel. And Pearman points out that the non-monotonicity of these implication relations and these incompatibility relations makes the concept, this whole constellation of commitments, holistic in a different sense, in a more radical sense than you get just by thinking of things in terms of the thinking of content in terms of the functional role that it has in some larger system. So this was the positive suggestion that Pearman made that I found most fascinating. So I'm sorry he couldn't come here and tell us about it. As I say, it's a thought I wish I had had myself, but different parts of my brain didn't seem to bring those together. Okay.
So thank you, Professor Brandom. I want to. We just spent an hour trying to get Pearman on this Zoom, and I have no idea. We tried several things, it didn't work. And I apologize for that. Professor Marcus Gabriel was supposed to be here too, but when we move online over to Zoom, he couldn't make it because he already had a prior commitment to January 14th. In any event, why don't we open it to the participants and see if there are questions, comments? You can signal or, okay, Stephen. Yes.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Hello, Stephen.
Hello. So just back to the original, Mark's original presentation in the issue of truth, I'm just wondering whether it would matter that we take into account Hegel's distinction between correctness and what he means by truth. Because of course, when he's talking about truth with a big T, he's not talking about empirical truths, right? He's talking about the concept coming to itself or becoming self-conscious about itself or something like this. And it seems like those two levels weren't at play in the debate between you and Mark. And I just wonder how that would make a difference.
Okay, good. I mean, it's true we weren't talking about these two and the two levels, and you're right, there are. And what Hegel says about philosophical concepts, speculative concepts, logical concepts, those he thinks you can have a finally correct set of, and he wouldn't understand their correctness as a matter of isomorphism, but there we can get permanent correctness, he thinks. In my critical reading, I actually take issue with that on his behalf, but I am committed to his account of experience as giving us a notion of truth that goes beyond correspondence in the case of ground level empirical concepts that he doesn't think we can get a stable and correct set of. I mean, the thing, though Mark and I both had it in mind, the passage in the preface of the Phenomenology where Hegel asks what is truth, why shouldn't we be skeptical, and which people who enjoy reading Hegel have always appreciated the contrast between the Aristotelian formula, saying of what is that it is, basis of a sort of correspondence theory, or maybe an identity theory, anyway, which Hegel thinks is a good starting point in his own account, as he says in the Bailey translation, that truth is a vast bacchanalian revel with not a soul sober, where no sooner does one member of the drinking party fall insensible beneath the table, but another takes his place. He's like, well, gee, I thought it was correspondence. No, it's a vast bacchanalian revel. Well, that's the process of experience here, and the commitments that you undertake are the participants, and the image, I think, is of them drunkenly elbowing each other. They're incompatible with each other, and some of them get forced out, but we retrospectively, recollectively bring in something else, bring in another commitment to keep the party going. And this is where he's saying, and truth is the party. Truth is a feature of this ongoing process, not a state that's achievable, that's even intelligible as achievable in the past, in the present, in the future, at some ideal. That's the Verstand, thinking of it as a state. It's an aspect of the process that also has as its aspect people falling, commitments falling insensible beneath the table. And so I think we can tell that whole story at the level of determinate commitments, and furthermore that Hegel in various places tells us that he means for that to be so. So even in the preface there, I think that account of the nature of truth is meant to apply to, claiming the frog is on the log.
So thank you so much for that. Are there any other questions? If I cannot see everyone at once, so okay, Joseph, go ahead.
Oh, he seems still to be muted.
Okay, hold on. Okay, now you should be able to.
Okay. Thank you both for the book and for the presentation and for the added duty of presenting Perman's presentation. And it struck me, and I wanted to see if this strikes you as correct, that part of the way in which you want to understand the kind of concern that Perman is raising, and the sense in which you think that the issues and the logic are already there in phenomenology, is in the way in which you're reconstruing recollection itself having a prospective dimension, which is what is captured in the notion of trust. That is, we can actually, in our recollection of a progressive history that culminates in the way we now construe the concepts, we're actually pushing that beyond that and trust in our successors to correct us where we've gone wrong. And it's in that situated perspective on the whole recollective process that you're seeing the phenomenology as already having that pronounced conception built in to the process of experience. Am I getting that rightly?
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's particularly well put. That we can focus on and the passage that Owl of Minerva flies only at dusk when philosophy comes on the scene. It's sort of too late, but and I mean, he does think that, but he also thinks that from the process of finding ourselves with materially incompatible commitments, when we rationally reconstruct how we got into that pickle, that's what gives us the impetus and the content for the next move. It's precisely by rationally reconstructing the history that brought you to finding yourself with commitments that by your own lights are incompatible that the new conception emerges. I mean, people have thought of this dialectic as though it were a mechanical sort of process, and it isn't at all. But though he thinks we can't see the details of the next phase in the history of Geist, that if we properly understand the previous phases, both what was progressive about the move to modernity and the flaw in it, the alienation that came with it, that's precisely what gives us the clues about the next progressive stage. And I think he practiced and theorized both about how one makes the next move in philosophy by rationally reconstructing the history up to the point that you're at. So, absolutely.
So thank you for that. I think we're about to run out of time. Professor Brandom, I remember that you were scheduled to give the Spinoza Lectures last spring. I read parts of them, and I wonder if you gave them and how the Spinoza Lectures relate to the Hegel book.
The Spinoza Lectures, I haven't given them. I'll give them this spring online.
Okay.
In Amsterdam, are an attempt to solve, to take Rorty's post-linguistic turn pragmatism to the next stage by reading him in the light of the lessons that I take Hegel to have taught us. Now, the Spinoza Lectures are the culmination of a semester's worth of course teaching in Amsterdam traditionally. And that course is going to be, the students are going to take that online because the course on Rorty and post-linguistic pragmatism, the graduate seminar that I gave at the University of Pittsburgh this last fall, because it had to be done remotely, is all available online through my website. And the text of the Spinoza Lectures is the readings for week 7 of that. So the students in Amsterdam are going to observe, are going to see the video recordings of my lectures for that. And then I will give those lectures.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. I cannot recommend highly enough these lectures because you put Rorty in dialogue with, of course, pragmatism, but Hegel in a really fascinating way. And in addition, you wrote a preface to these lectures that Rorty gave.
These came back from a search.
Yeah. Oh, my phone is talking to me. So that preface to these lectures of Rorty from 1996 will be
which Harvard Press is putting out under your editorship. Yes.
So I recommend that you keep an eye for those, which are really amazing. I have been authorized to go over time, so perhaps if there are any other questions, comments, so you can raise your hand or signal to me in the chat that you want to ask a question. It's really unfortunate that we could not have Marcus Gabriel and Herman Steckler. And apologize, we tried everything. I don't know what was going on. Yeah, apparently Russians can get in onto our websites in government, but a German cannot get into a philosophy conference.
Well, thank you all then. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.